Alright guys, how's it going? In the mid 1990s, I took a Bachelor of Science in Computing. Now, the mid 90s weren't yesterday, but I still remember much of what that course comprised. It covered both the hardware and the software side of computing, and I learned to program wonderful languages such as COBOL and Pascal. I also learned about computer architecture and networking before the internet really took off. I think it's fair to say that most of you know me well enough by now, and you know I'm a hardware guy. I'm always talking about the ins and outs of the hardware itself, particularly the silicon. So you might think that after finishing at university in the late 90s, I went on to work in electrical engineering or in semiconductor manufacturing, right? Wrong. Those kind of opportunities didn't really exist in the UK back then, or were exceedingly rare. What did exist though, in very high demand, were jobs in programming. And as it happens, back then, programming was my first love anyway. So I actually became a programmer. I learned a variety of obscure and archaic programming languages, and I worked for an American freight forwarding company who employed me as a Unix and network programmer. At one point I even taught programming. The cool thing about back then in the 90s was everything was a bit simpler, and yet it was still far easier to stand out because, unlike today, not everybody was a programmer. Back in the mid-90s, the hardware side of things was also a lot simpler. The 3D graphics cards we know today were in the research and development phase. Multi-core CPUs still didn't exist either, but something else had started to change on CPUs around that time. And that change was the inclusion of cache memory. To understand why cache memory ended up on the CPU means going back even further, to the early 80s and the home computer boom. The first home computer processors ran at, by today's standards, extremely low clock speeds of single-digit megahertz. My first computer, the Sinclair Spectrum 48K Plus, had a Z80 microprocessor, a single-core CPU running at a dizzying 3.5 MHz. Note though that back then, nobody actually called these single-core chips. They were simply processors, microprocessors, or CPUs, which of course stands for Central Processing Units. The CPU was known as the heart of the computer, so the memory was the brain of the computer. And my Spectrum had a total of 48K kilobytes of RAM. This here, towards the right, is the Z80 processor. And these chips here are all the memory chips. In total, the entire RAM in the Spectrum was 48K. I first learned to program on my Spectrum when I was 8 or 9 years old. And forgive me for this little tangent, but my father, who at the time was in his mid-60s, also learned how to program on the Spectrum. He had been retired for years from work due to ill health. Like many other UK men of that generation, he had been a coal miner all of his life, and in the end it killed him through lung disease. But I will never forget coming home from school, hoping to play some game on my computer, yet not being able to shift my dad off it because he was too busy coding. I wasn't even 10 years old, but the utterly captivating nature of computers was already crystal clear to me. But as I was saying, I first learned programming when I was 8 or 9 years old. Back then I would have been programming stuff like fighting games where guys called Bob and Tom fought each other to the death using varied weaponry. For this next section of the video, you're going to have to afford me a little bit of artistic license. Right, so let's say you have a character in a fighting game called Bob, and he has 10 hit points. Bob had an enemy called Tom, who has a crossbow which causes 5 damage. I would code that in Sinclair Basic with a few lines of code, something like this. Start off with Bob hit points equals 10. Sinclair Basic required line numbering, which is something that most languages ditched a long time ago. It made absolutely no sense, but that's what it had. And if we look through this amazing program, we can see some data. We have variables like Bob hit points and Tom weapon damage, and their associated values of 10, crossbow, and 5. So in these first 6 lines of code, lines 10 to 60, the Z80 CPU creates that data, which is then stored in the Spectrum's memory. Just imagine it as you see it. For example, I'm missing a line here. Tom hit points equals 6. So on line 40, the CPU creates a variable called Tom hit points and gives it the value of 6. And that data is stored in the memory all the way over here, or possibly in here. Line 70 is where the actual fight starts. We have a print command which prints out whatever follows onto the screen. And we can break this down from left to right. So first of all, it prints out this. Tom attacks Bob with A. But then we get to this plus Tom weapon part. What happens now in the program is the CPU needs to find out what this Tom weapon actually means. And so it takes a long trip over to the Spectrum's memory and finds that Tom weapon has a value of crossbow. So in the print statement, Tom attacks Bob with a plus Tom weapon becomes Tom attacks Bob with a crossbow. Then the word for is added. Concatenated is the proper terminology. So now we have this, which gives us Tom attacks Bob with a crossbow for. Now just as before with Tom weapon, at this point the CPU needs to find out what Tom weapon damage stands for. So once again, it takes a long trip over to the Spectrum's memory and finds Tom weapon damage and the value of 5. And we're almost finished now, and right at the end, we simply concatenate damage to the end of the print command, which gives us a final result of Tom attacks Bob with a crossbow for 5 damage. Now, line 80, the next line of code, has further trips out to memory in order to find what values are stored in the Bob hit points and Tom weapon damage variables, so it can perform a math operation, a subtraction, which is Bob hit points minus Tom weapon damage. We know that Bob has 10 hit points and the crossbow does 5 damage. So that's a simple 10 minus 5, which leaves us with 5, and finally at the end concatenate hit points left. But this last Tom weapon damage, is where this gets interesting, because in the previous line of code, we already made the trip to the Spectrum's memory to find out what value was stored in Tom weapon damage, the value of 5. However, in this very next line of code, we use Tom weapon damage again. The CPU has to go all the way over to the Spectrum's memory to find what value is stored in Tom weapon damage again, even though we just used it. Now this is clearly an extremely simple example of a game. But believe it or not, this isn't that far off how games were programmed back in the day, in BASIC at least. And in most cases this was fine because the CPUs were dog slow, the memory was dog slow, so it was a good match. But CPU speeds started to improve quickly, while memory speeds improved much more slowly. And pretty soon it didn't matter how quickly the CPU was able to perform arithmetic or logic operations, because the program was bottlenecked by the speed at which it could get hold of the data it needed to perform those operations. The time it was taking for those trips out to the computer's memory, the latency, was a real problem. What's the point in having faster CPUs when they're totally bottlenecked by the speed of accessing the memory? Of course, there was a simple solution. If those trips out to memory are taking too long, then we need to shorten the trip. We need to bring some memory closer to the CPU, or even better, on to the CPU. It was 1989 when Intel first put memory on the CPU with the 80486, which was also the first 1 million plus transistor x86 chip for that reason. Here we can see a die shot with the memory cache, which looks like 4 blocks of 2K of cache for a total of 8 kilobytes of cache memory. Is that really enough memory for the 90s when we'd got used to 64K of RAM or even 128K of RAM back in the 80s? Well, the thing about this new memory cache on the CPU was that even though it was a lot smaller, it was much faster than system RAM. So the trick was to ensure that only the most frequently used data was stored on the cache. If we go back to my gaming example again, and the last 2 lines, lines 70 and 80, where the fight takes place. Remember that on line 70, we had to take a trip out to the memory to find the value stored in Tom weapon damage, only to have to do it again in the very next line. With a CPU cache, the first time any data is accessed from the main memory, a copy of it is stored in the cache. So all of these variables here, basically the data for the entire game, that will first of all be read from the system memory, but at the same time copied to the CPU cache. So now the next time the CPU needs to access the information in Tom Weapon Damage, which in our case was the very next line of code, it looks in the CPU cache first of all. And of course it finds it and then completes this line of code in a fraction of the time it would have taken had it needed to go all the way out to the main memory again. And every subsequent time the computer needed that information, it was usually right nearby in the cache. Computer software is actually quite predictable, even games. If your program is doing something or using certain pieces of data, like Tom Weapon Damage for example, the chances are it will use that data over and over at any one time. So the value of having fast memory on the CPU was clear, and cache sizes began to increase as even more and more area of the CPU was given over to it. But increasing the size of the L1 cache also increased the latency, so it soon became a trade-off between size and speed. The answer to this growing problem was to add a second level of cache, L2 cache. The first level, the L1 cache, would remain relatively small, which is why it's been around the same 32 kilobyte size for years, although it's now split into two different caches of around that size. One cache for instructions and one cache for data. The instruction cache holds the most frequently used programming instructions, while the data cache holds the most frequently used data. The level 2 cache was allowed to grow a bit larger, which again meant that it was slower than L1, however still much faster than going out to the main memory. L2 caches hold both instructions and data and are often inclusive of the level 1. That is, all the blocks held in L1, both instructions and data, are also held in the L2. Before this one gets overly complicated too quickly, perhaps the best thing to do right now is explain how multi-level caches work, and for that we'll continue to use my programming example. CPU caches are actually divided into blocks where each instruction or piece of data is stored. You remember, when the CPU first creates the data, all of these variables and gives them values, all of that gets stored in the main system memory. When the CPU first attempts to use the Tom Weapon Damage data, a read request is sent to the CPU's memory controller, which first of all looks in the L1 cache. If it doesn't find Tom Weapon Damage in a block of L1, the memory controller then searches the L2 instead. And if Tom Weapon Damage still wasn't found in the L2, then it is fetched from the main memory and copied to both the L1 and the L2 caches. So the next time in the program, the CPU looks for that Tom Weapon Damage data again, it will find it very quickly in the L1. Now imagine over the course of the game, the L1 cache starts to fill up with the most frequently used data. Our main character Bob maybe found some armour, which reduces the damage he takes, and perhaps he also learned how to cast spells. So he now has mana points as well as hit points. This is all very important data, which will be frequently used by the program. And we can see the caches are starting to fill up. But let's say he now finds a potion which can replace lost health. As before, when the program tries to use this data, a read request is sent to the memory controller, which first of all looks in L1, then the L2, before finding it in main memory. And we know that when it's found in main memory, this Bob Health Potion equals 4 data is copied to both the L1 and L2 caches. However, let's say that's enough and there is no more free blocks left in the L1 cache. So something else has to be evicted from it. In this case, it was Bob Mana Points which was evicted. The player hadn't cast any spells for a few seconds, and so that data wasn't being read recently. So Bob Mana Points is evicted out of the L1 in order to make room for Bob Health Potion. However, Bob Mana Points stays in the L2 rather than being evicted from that as well. The reason for this is pretty simple. If it was in the L1 previously, then chances are it will be needed in the L1 again soon, even if it's not needed right now. And that reasoning makes perfect sense because the next time Bob casts a spell, which presumably won't be that far off, the program checks to make sure he has enough mana points first of all, Bob Mana Points, in order to cast that spell. And instead of having to go all the way back to main memory in order to find that data, it is of course still much closer in the L2 cache. And as you know, whenever data is read from the L2, a copy is placed in the L1. which does of course mean that something else will then be evicted from the L1 cache. If you're wondering, yes, data will also finally be evicted from the L2, at which point it will be removed from the L1 as well. The reasoning there is, if the data has been in the L2 long enough without being used, chances are it's just been wasting space in the L1 cache too, right? So that simple example here is basically what inclusion means regarding caches, and it's a passable explanation of how caches work in general. It's all about the most frequently used data being as short a trip away from the CPU as possible. Many CPUs today of course have not only L1 and L2, but also L3 cache. Just as L2 is larger and slower than the L1, the L3 is larger and slower than the L2, but still quite a bit faster than system memory. The first consumer CPU to include L3 was the Pentium 4 Extreme Edition, which had a mammoth 2 megabytes of L3 cache back in 2003. That was actually a repurposed server CPU, as Intel had to go to unprecedented lengths in order to remain somewhat competitive. It was only a couple of years later when we got the first dual-core CPUs, and L3 cache became even more important for the reason that while each CPU core kept its own L1 and L2, the large L3 was shared between the cores. Soon we had quad cores, and L3 caches became larger and larger over time, as the chip architects tried to push the trip to system memory further and further away. For the next part of this video, I'll take a look at the most recent big CPU architecture change, which was obviously Zen. Zen arrived in 2017 with 8 cores divided over 2 core complexes, CCXs of 4 cores each. Here we can see one complex on the left, 1, 2, 3, 4 cores, and another identical complex on the right, again with 4 cores. Looking at an individual complex, we can see the 4 cores, 0, 1, 2, 3, and a large shared level 3 cache in the middle. Now, as discussed previously, each core has its own level 1 data and instruction caches. And here we can actually see a single Zen core. And now that same core annotated, we can see the level 1 data cache and the level 1 instruction cache. These are very small at only 32K and 64K respectively, right inside the core as you can see. And just to the right of this, we can see the level 2 cache. This is 512K of L2 cache, again as part of the core. And zooming out to this nice image again, we see the large shared 8MB of L3 cache in the middle with 2 cores either side. So level 1 data cache, level 1 instruction cache, the level 2 cache here, and then all the shared level 3 cache in the middle. Remember that this is just one core complex, and Zen has 2 of these on one chip. So in total, the chip would have 16 megabytes of L3 cache. The L2 cache in Zen is, of course, inclusive of L1. And we know that that means any data in the L1, instructions and data caches, is also held in the L2. And whenever data is read from the memory, a copy of it is placed in both the L1 and the L2. This 8MB of L3 cache, however, is a victim cache. I used the word evicted earlier when discussing what happens when data is removed from the L1 and L2 caches. A victim cache, like Zen's, is exclusive. When data is read from the memory, a copy of it is placed in the L1 and L2 as normal, but it is not placed in the L3. In fact, the only way that data can enter Zen's L3 cache is if it is evicted from L2. So obviously, the L1 cache needs to be filled with data before the L2 cache is then filled with data, at which point the older data, the data that hasn't been accessed recently, for example, Bob Health Potion equals 4, and when I say recently here, we could be talking in terms of under a second or a few seconds, but this data is evicted from the L2 cache into the L3 cache. The logic follows a similar pattern to before. That is, if the data was used previously, then chances are it will be used again at some point soon, and it is better off being held in the L3 cache instead of just being held in the system memory. What is interesting is Zen's core complex setup means that even though the CPU has 16 megabytes total L3 cache, in most cases we see it's really only got 8 megabyte available at typical L3 cache speeds. I'll try to explain this as best as I can using a very interesting post at Reddit by BF Booger, which actually gave me the idea which morphed into this video. Near the beginning of the post, BF Booger says, a single Zen chiplet has two CCXs, each with its own L3 cache. As a victim cache, the only way that data gets into CCX0's L3 cache is if it was first in one of the L1 or L2 caches on one of the cores there. Likewise for CCX1. So that's what I just explained. Zen's L3 cache can only be filled by evicted data from its L2 cache on one of its 4 cores. Let's take a single-threaded program which needs a piece of information. Hell, let's use my program as an example again, as that is definitely single-threaded. The first time it needs the information, it grabs it from the main memory and copies it into the L1 and L2. Over time, the caches fill up and data spills into the L3. But what happens after the L3 is filled? Does evicted data then go over to the L3 in the second CCX? No, it does not. Because we know that the only way the L3 cache in the second core complex can be filled is by evicted data from the L2 of one of the cores there. So the only way to get data into the second core complex's L3 is by using the cores on the second core complex. So let's say you do that. You add a second thread to your program which uses the 5th core, labelled here as core 4, as the cores on the first CCX are labelled 0 to 3. To start with, all the cache on the second CCX is empty. So when that 5th core needs to read data, first of all, it won't find anything in its own L1, L2 or L3. So it takes a trip over to the other core complex to have a look, and luckily, it then finds the data it needs in the first core complex's L3 cache. As we know, that data is then copied into the L1 and L2 of that core. But what happens if it doesn't find anything in the other core complex? Well then, it basically has to go to main memory. This is exactly the same thing that happens in low-threaded programs. If your program only ever has a single thread, it will fill up the L3 in one core complex, then go to the main memory after that. The L3 on the other complex will remain unused, along with the rest of the entire CCX, in fact. With that in mind, is it possible that what many people are analysing as Zen's cross-CCX penalty is in fact the result of Zen going to main memory? And is there a way to test this? Well, I sure tried. My first task was to find a cache benchmarking program, and for that I opted to use user benchmark. The reason for this was, this is where we saw the first leak of Zen 2's cache performance, in a leaked 12-core sample. I'll get back to this later, but for now I decided to run a battery of tests on my own 2700X CPU. My first idea was to test different memory speeds. My system has 16 megabytes of DDR4 3400, so I ran 6 tests at 3400 mega transfers per second, and then after that, another 6 tests at 2133 mega transfers per second. I will take a closer look at the 3400 mega transfers result in order to explain what is going on and to reinforce what we've already learned. Now, scrolling down to near the bottom of the benchmark, and we get to the system memory latency ladder. L1, L2, L3 CPU cache and main memory access latencies in nanoseconds. Nanoseconds on the y-axis and memory sizes on the x. So I believe how the benchmark works is simply by filling the memory system with data up to this amount, then randomly accessing some of that data multiple times. So for example, in the first benchmark of 8 kilobytes, all of this data will easily fit into Zen's L1 cache. So all subsequent random accesses will find the data in the L1. Looking at the other end of the scale, and 128 megabytes of memory to be accessed. It should be clear that on a CPU which only has 16 megabytes of L3, the vast majority of a 128 megabyte random access will occur in the main system memory. But getting back to the left of the scale again, and we know Zen has 32k of L1 data cache, and if we mouse over the first 3 values of 8, which shows 1.05 nanoseconds, 16, again 1.05 nanoseconds, and 32k, again 1.05 nanoseconds. That is some very small latencies. 1 nanosecond is 1 billionth of a second. When we get to 64K though, it's doubled to just over 2 nanoseconds. Now with this information, we can be pretty sure that this latency program measured 32K of L1, right? The reason why it doubled at 64K is that at 64K, it's accessing the L1 cache half of the time and the L2 the other half of the time. So we might deduce that the L1 cache of the 2700X is around about 1 nanosecond, 1.05, and the L2 cache must be around about 3 nanoseconds. If accessing half of each gives an average result near 2 nanoseconds. And this appears to be correct, as by looking at 128K, 2.56 nanoseconds, and then 256K, we see a rise up to 2.8 nanoseconds. At the 256K mark, around 1/8 of the reads will be L1 cache, while the other 7/8 will be the slower L2 reads. We know the limit of L2 is 512 kilobytes per core, and we can see that between 512K and 1 megabyte, the latencies nearly double again. Once again, this is because we've now filled the L2. The level 2 was filled at the 512 kilobytes mark. And so at 1 megabyte, half of the reads are now taking place in the level 3. Onward from 1 megabyte, the latencies continue to rise fairly slowly all the way up to 8 megabytes, which is the limit of the L3 victim cache on one core complex. And then we see a large increase at 16 megabytes. What caused that? Well, after the 8 megabyte of L3 victim cache was filled, the latency measuring program then went to the main memory. I know this because after testing the whole 2700X CPU, which is 4 cores on each CCX remember, I then disabled the cores on the second CCX to test 4+0. When looking at the 4+0 test, which remember means only one CCX, the results were very similar to 4+4, flipping between each and we can barely see any difference. This first one, 4+4, and the second one, 4+0. The reason 16 megabytes is halfway is simply that half the reads are in the cache, 8 megabyte and below, while the other half, 8 megabyte to 16 megabytes, are taking place in the computer's main memory. At 32 megabytes, we're reading an awful lot from main memory, and that continues on, which is why we get a near flat line afterwards. By this point at the end, 128 megabytes, the benchmark is basically a benchmark of system memory, not the cache, because the vast majority of reads are accessing the main memory. Only 8 megabytes would be cache, 120 megabytes would be memory. And so the latencies we see here are pretty much the latency of the main memory. Putting all the results in a table, and we see that indeed there wasn't much of a difference at all. Over the 6 runs at the 8 megabyte mark, the average latency of one CCX was 15.74 nanoseconds, whereas the average latency with 2 CCXs and all 8 cores was 15.32 nanoseconds. And in actual fact, at 16 megabyte mark, the average was slightly lower on the 4 cores compared to the 8. But that's all within margin of error. I went on to test multiple configurations, including 2 cores in each complex, and even 2 cores in one complex. And I also tried out 1 core. They all gave similar results, except, curiously, 2+2, which consistently performed better than anything else, including 4+4. For some reason on Zen, having 2 cores on each complex appears to be better than 4 cores on each, or 4 cores on one complex and none on the other, at least in terms of latency. Trying to figure that one out spawned another day of testing. I asked some guys on my Patreon Discord to help out in confirming my results, and they did. 2+2 is simply better than 4+4, at least in terms of user benchmark. Just let me say thanks to everybody who helped out with this, including with some batch file writing in Windows, testing different cache latency programs, and just general explanations of what could be going on. And now to finish this long video off with some Zen 2 stuff again. And this is pretty curious. As I already mentioned, the reason for using this user benchmark site was that a leaked Zen 2 sample appeared there. For some reason it had some very weak memory, 2666 mega transfers and rather poor CL19 timings. So let's analyse the latency result of that. The L1 was up to 1.14 nanoseconds. Remember, my 2700X was 1.05 nanoseconds. So there's definitely a regression in performance there. And in fact, we see a very small regression in latency performance all the way up to 8 megabytes, where it gets very interesting. Going back to my 2700X, as I mentioned, at 16 megabytes, the latency rises dramatically as we are now accessing system memory around 50% of the time. But going back to this new Zento engineering sample, and we can see that the random access time remains much closer to the 8 megabyte result, before then jumping dramatically at 32 megabytes. So the 2700X jumps dramatically from 8 to 16, but this new 12-core engineering sample only jumps after 16, very dramatically it has to be said, up to 32 megabytes. If you recall, in multiple previous videos now, I said that this W cache configuration that we once again see in this engineering sample almost certainly meant that the CPU, which for the 12-core will comprise 2 chiplets, remember, this W means that the chip has 64 megabytes of total L3 cache. We can now say that is even more likely to be true, as this cache latency result means that the L3 cache on each chiplet will have doubled from 16 megabytes to 32 megabytes, and obviously that is down to an increase in L3 cache from 8 megabytes to 16 megabytes per CCX. So double the cache per chiplet and 2 chiplets equals 64 megabytes of L3 cache. But what is happening up here at 32 megabyte and beyond? The curious rise at 32 megabyte up to a glacial 97 nanoseconds before dropping down to a not much better, it has to be said, 91, 92 nanoseconds. But we know that that is down to the very slow DDR4 2666 CL19 memory. The reason for this rise though is unknown. However, we know all about the I/O die by now, and that would be a likely culprit. We do not see this behaviour on Zen 1. The curve is much less steep compared to this engineering sample. But now this is where the story gets a little bit bizarre. I was doing an awful lot of testing on this, and you can see that on my results page. This is around 66 benchmarks, each of which took over 3 minutes to run. There was nothing particularly standout curious in 65 of these benchmarks, but one was. So here is a benchmark of 2 cores on one CCX and 0 cores on the other. And scrolling down to the system memory latency ladder, for some reason, the benchmark exhibited weird behaviour at 8 megabytes of L3 this time, rising quickly from 10 nanoseconds at 4 megabyte up to 34 nanoseconds at 8 megabyte, before continuing to rise in the usual fashion. Looking at the other 2+0 results shows the curiosity. Run 1, pretty much the same as any other benchmark regardless of core count, and we see the same at run 2. Run 3 is the weird one, clearly. The large increase in latency at 8 megabyte, while run 4, run 5, run 6 and run 7 are all standard. I was only supposed to benchmark 6 runs, however I was also adding the results to the table at the time, and that's when I spotted that run 3 was a bit off. So that's why I ran 7, as I knew that the flawed number 3 benchmark would be thrown out. So one strange outlier in 66 benchmarks. That happens in benchmarking though. It could be anything causing it, and I wouldn't even attempt to figure out what it was. But what's so bizarre about this is, only a few hours earlier, this same 12-core engineering sample, which showed this behaviour, also threw out a similar result. As we can see in the second run, where we see a large increase in latency between 8 and 16 megabytes. Remember the first run? The latency increase was much smaller between 8 and 16 megabytes. Only 7 nanoseconds of a difference. But in this second run, you're looking at a difference of 40 nanoseconds for the exact same engineering sample. This engineering sample has only been run twice that we know of, and the second one shows the same kind of flaw as that single result of mine did. a dramatic rise in latency between 8 and 16 megabytes when the previous results did not exhibit any of that behaviour. So that got me thinking. You can imagine, right? Some engineer at AMD is testing the new Zen 2 chips out on this standard AMD Myrtle test motherboard. So he's testing out the latency on the 12th core, and then this weird blimp of results get thrown out, and panic ensues. Zen 2 is delayed by months as they try to figure out what the cause is. But no, I think what's much more likely to be going on here is that some AMD engineer is testing this offline a lot. And after a bunch of testing, they finally found a weird result and decided to upload it. Because why not? And that actually got me thinking, if this is what they have done with this second flawed run, who's to say they didn't also do that with the first run? We have got no way of currently knowing if any of these results are true. And to round this one off, it just got even more bizarre a few days later when this new engineering sample was discovered. Again, it points to another 12-core CPU. That's what the C stands for. And again, the W after it stands for 64 megabytes of L3 cache. The clock speeds on this one are a little bit lower than we've seen previously. 3.3 GHz boost clock and a 2.9 GHz base clock. And it also appears to only be running 4 cores without SMT. So here is where it gets really strange. The motherboard is a Foxconn H55 MXV series, an Intel motherboard from years ago. And looking up the CPU device ID shows that the CPU is actually an Intel Q740, but there is no way that the results of this CPU can be for that CPU. And right at the bottom, and the latency graph, we see something that we saw earlier. That curious rise up to a peak before dropping to the speed of the memory. The same as we saw in the first example. This doesn't appear to happen with the first generation Ryzen, as far as I can tell. But now we see it again in this next engineering sample. Latencies, however, in this second one are actually very good, which is only around about 55 nanoseconds on a memory trip, which is closer to the best Intel CPUs. Perhaps most interesting though, is these early cache latencies. 32K all the way down to 0.81 nanoseconds. That is matching or faster than the fastest 9900Ks. But 3 12-core engineering samples, all exhibiting different behaviour, and this last one looks like a particularly bad attempt at hiding something. Or maybe it's just a random spoof. However, if so, they've gone to quite some lengths to make it look fake, using an AMD engineering sample in an LGA 1156 motherboard. I mean, if you were gonna fake something, would you not at least try to make it a good one? So, curious indeed. I feel like I've said that a lot though. If we assume that this first one is correct, and that seems most likely based on what we know about Zen 2's cache, then simply by doubling the L3 from 8 to 16 megabytes should help a lot. CPUs like Intel's 9900K have got real 16 megabyte of L3 cache. However, it's not particularly fast, as we can see from the latency graph, and certainly nowhere near as fast as what this Zen 2 engineering sample, the first one, appears to be. Remember though that this will still be 4 cores and 8 threads on one CCX. So if a game uses more threads that spill over into the second or even the third and fourth CCXs, then we may start to see more penalties from cross CCX latency. Essentially though, this is an optimization issue. If a game ran on 2 CCXs and was optimized well enough to keep all the relevant data on the same CCX, then latencies could in theory remain extremely good all the way to even 32 megabytes of L3, or even 64 megabytes in the truly well-threaded, well-optimized applications. The hardware is there already on Zen, it just needs the software capable of demonstrating it. And I guess what Mark Papermaster said recently to Tom's Hardware makes a lot of sense from multiple perspectives now. The optimization that we worked with the industry as we first rolled out Ryzen was our core complex, Papermaster said. We very successfully worked across the operating system with Windows and Linux, so there's a recognition of AMD's core complex, and so you can really have your workloads leverage that organisation. As we go forward into this next generation with Zen 2 based products, we actually just make it easier because as you have cores going into a common I/O die, it is the same core complex approach that we had before, and you actually just have a very centralized path. In our server implementation, all the way through the Ryzen implementation we showed today, it adds no complication whatsoever for the software providers. All the work we did with first generation Ryzen will carry right over. All those optimizations carry right over. You may be wondering what else could be done at the coding level. It's important to note that the CPU decides what goes into the cache, not the programmer. However, a programmer can certainly guide what enters the cache by using sensible programming techniques, especially sequential data accesses and not doing a bunch of random stuff at the same time. But essentially, I think really what it comes down to is this is a multi-threading thing, and that's becoming the standard way to code over time anyway. Whether or not there is some special sauce in Zen 2 which allows for better use of its cache compared to Zen 1, I just don't know. There are many issues like cache coherency, which, while not unsurmountable, basically come down to design choices and even performance per watt. With AMD, it's usually when, not if, and we may see something really exotic with Zen 4. Right, I'm done with this one, and it's been pretty heavy on the analysis again, which is just starting to wear on me a little bit now. So there will be a change of focus for the next one, and with a bit of luck, it won't be 7 days before you see it. As a heads up, I've been receiving a ridiculous amount of emails recently, and they've started taking up an awful lot of my time. I get that many of you have interesting theories, etc., and I love to read them, but also understand that your theory is one of maybe 5 or 6 that I am getting on a daily basis, and they're often all pretty deep, requiring expert knowledge of something or other to grasp fully. So for me to just slightly grasp one would take me a lot of reading comprehension. 5 or 6 of them per day, I just cannot deal with. I'm not ignoring your emails. I read every single one of them. However, I can't respond to them all, and I can't afford the time to research everything while also making video and doing all the rest of the stuff that competes for my time. So my heads up is, unless it's extremely pressing news or a really great leak, I am making February an email-free month until I can get over my current backlog. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you later, guys.